Welcome to another episode of Gaijin artificially nerfs all British technology to make it even less competitive in real life, because if it was accurately modeled, Great Britain would have 100% win rates across the board, because the Eurofighter was supposed to be the best thing ever, and because it's not the best thing ever in the game, and because the other nations have things that are broadly comparable to it and are broadly balanced, this plane's actually not any good, and we're not going to play it anymore, and we need to grind the Rafale because the Rafale is just too good. It does everything the Eurofighter's supposed to do. Even though the Rafale has an ASA radar, the Eurofighter had the best mechanically scanned radar ever invented. It was basically on par with an electronically scanned radar, even though that technology is a quantum leap ahead of basically anything else. But if you read the literature, you would understand that the Eurofighter is the best, and because it's not unequivocally the best at everything ever, we can't play the thing. Welcome to WarThunder. I am Squish, and we're doing another kind of boring video about the Eurofighter, because I wanted to talk about it. I want to talk about the radar stuff. I want to talk about how Gaijin kind of actually did do the Eurofighter radar dirty, and after 3 months of playing this plane and 3 months of kind of experiencing Rafale, Eurofighter, all the new stuff, the new meta, to kind of give you some kind of my own perspective about it. You know, it's something to cover. You know, that's what we are. We're a commentary channel. So, number one, we have to understand the radars in the game. Like, what do the radars do and how they work, and the boobity boop and the whoopity whoop, and how the shwoopity shwoop goes into your TV screen kind of thing. And where Gaijin models things good and where they model things not good. And spoilers, the part where Gaijin models things not good is where it is really, really hampered the best mechanically scanned radar ever invented, because every halfway good mechanically scanned radar is not really, like, greatly modeled. Now, what do I mean by that? So, the one thing that Gaijin models pretty well, pretty accurately, or at least, you know, does better than DCS, is they model everything that happens in front of the radar. As in, there's electromagnetic waves that are modeled, and they propagate, and then they ping the plane, and once you have swept through the plane 2 times, it's supposed to create a what's called a track file. That's when you get your TWS contact. It pops up, and it's supposed to pop up on the radar screen, and that's all well and good. But what this means is your radar has to scan a target twice, in theory, and then it'll populate. And if it doesn't scan it twice, if it takes a long time to scan it twice, or if it takes too long to scan it twice, that contact disappears, and then it starts over again. You have to scan it once, and scan it twice again, and then it disappears again. And it's in theory, it should work fine. In practice, because of other unrelated bugs, which the number one, the primary kind of like bug that has affected all radars for the past like 6 months to a year, is something that we have colloquially described as double scan. Now, if you look at your radar and you look at the way the beam moves and look at the little cursor that's on the left side that you slide up and down, basically what happens is the radar scans left to right, and then the dish drops down 1 step, scans again, drops down 1, scans again, drops down to the bottom step, scans again, and then it repeats the same thing going from the bottom back up. So it goes top to bottom, bottom to top. And what this means is, if you kind of time things out, it means that the 2 scans that are on the edges, the top and the bottom scan, will repeat and then have a long period of time between them before the radar beam gets back up there. That means that your refresh rate, your kind of lag time, or whatever you want to call it, is very variable. It means that if it's in the center, you'll get kind of the correct amount of like radar beams where like the timing almost works the way that it's supposed to. But the further you are to the edge, the more inconsistent it is. That's why sometimes you get a radar and you're like, oh, it populates right away, and sometimes like it's missing. It's like right there, man. It's right there. The other thing that Gaijin has not done, and one of the big problems with modeling, is you got to think of the radar in kind of like a couple of different components, a couple of different modeling components, because you have the thing in the front, you got the radar dish that shoots out the radar beams, and then you have the gimbal, the thing that swivels the radar around and makes it point all over the place. And then you've got the computer behind it, the data processing, all the good stuff. And then you got like the TV screen, like the little green square that pops up on the on the right side of the screen. The thing that Gaijin has not done for all of their modern radars, for the most part, is they have not modeled any of the computerization that goes into how the radar searches. So what this actually means is instead of doing like a search pattern or doing kind of a programming logic that makes sense, it does it in the least efficient way possible. And what I mean by this is if you do any kind of research into like how radars work and how the radar controller works, is basically in computer programming language, like there's priority task, and depending on what is going on in front of the radar, the computer can decide what the priority task is and kind of adapt to it and, figure things out a little bit quicker. And a really practical way to think about this is when the radar scans a contact, when it hits it the first time, what would be the most logical thing to do? Would you hit it the first time and they go, hey, there's something there, let's confirm that something there, and scan it again right away, and it would take milliseconds? Or do you go through the whole entire search pattern all the way to the bottom, all the way to the top, and then decide, let's, okay, now we can scan it again. And the way that Gaijin's radar implementation works is basically the latter part. Like your radar, the computer processing power that goes into it is basically the equivalent of a Nintendo 64, maybe? Probably not even that, like a freaking, just an analog calculator, to be honest. Like, it's just on the thing, it does the thing, it does not prioritize jobs, it doesn't do anything that modern radars would do. Like, for instance, one of the big things with Captor-M, one of their marketing terminology things is data adaptive scanning. And that's, I hate to be the negative Nelly here, but that's probably something that all the other, like, modern radars are capable of doing with all of the software updates, because those modules and whatnot, those get updated as well. And what data adaptive scanning really means is there's a computer, there's an algorithm where, depending on where the target is, how far away the target is, the radar cross-section, all this kind of like different stuff will determine whether or not to dedicate as much resources to tracking it. And the way that this would work, so imagine for a second you have a bomber at 100 miles away. It's like a B-52. It's really slow. And you got a radar beam that's like 4 degrees wide. Well, guess what? You ping the plane once, and you know that it's this big. You know that it's probably can't move this much in that amount of time. So by the time you come back to it to try to scan it again, you don't have to look that hard for it. The same thing is with like with fighter planes. If you got one that's really far away and it hasn't changed course, isn't doing anything, you probably don't need to dedicate that much of like your radar time to doing that. And one of the things that the Eurofighter people did with the radar is basically the antenna, the forward part of it is whatever. It's a legacy system, and it's basically, they developed a mechanical radar when everyone else was trying to develop ASA and PESA radars and whatnot. And they did an okay job, but the front end of it is kind of obsolescent. On the other hand, the back end of it, they made a really, allegedly, very good gimbal that can swivel very quickly. And because it's the 1990s, they presumably had more computer processing power. And the way that this works is basically when the radar dish gets below a previously populated target, it's supposed to snap to it, ping it really quick, and then go back to doing its scan pattern. And it can do this for a certain number of contacts, and then eventually you get too much movement of the radar dish, and like then it can't keep up. Or if it did try to keep up, you're swiveling the damn thing at 300 degrees per second all the time, and you blow out the ball bearings, and then it just like kills itself. That kind of thing. So that's kind of the big problem is, yes, the radar has more or less the correct scan rate. It's probably like, it's off by like 5 degrees per second, because I don't know if they implemented the 70 degree scan pattern. But the big thing is the computerization just isn't there. At the same time, the way they've implemented the ASA radars and the PESA radars is kind of more accurate and kind of does what the Captor-M is more or less supposed to do, but with more limitations, of where the ASA radars and the PESA radars are kind of modeled as like two radars in one, where one is a search radar that works like a normal mechanically scanned radar, where it goes through its whole entire pattern, and then there's a tracking radar that's coupled with it that basically keeps track of targets that are populated, and once they're populated, it'll keep them tracked as long as they're within the field of view of the radar. That is fine. That is kind of more or less the way it's supposed to work. But it means that the Eurofighter radar came to the game in a state it kind of sucks. It's very terribly mediocre compared to the really good radars. And this has some impacts on how good the plane is to play in the game. Because, yes, I can argue, and I will argue, that the Eurofighter is probably one of the best planes in the game, minus the Rafale. The Rafale is literally the only other plane that is relevant in this discussion. And if you compare the two on paper, there are advantages for both of them. The AIM-120 is a missile that is better at range. It is a missile that is worse up close. The Mica is a missile that's better up close, but it's worse at range. The Mica has a better high off-bore sight capability than the AMRAAM. And it means that if you kind of put these planes on paper, there's kind of a spacing bubble where the advantage starts with the Typhoon. You have better presence at long range, and then at medium range, the Mica is something that you have to worry about more. And then once you get to closer range, the AIM-9M has advantages over the Magic II. Like, if you're shooting an IR missile at medium range, especially side aspect, the 9M is better than Magic II. But then once you get closer, once the circles collapse down even closer, then the Magic II has an advantage, and then the circle collapses into gun range, and then the Typhoon has an advantage. And the problem with this whole entire theory of kind of arguing which plane is the best, is that medium range circle for the Mica ends up being a lot more relevant for getting kills for a lot of people than the long range missiles or guns. Because guess what? The performance gap between the Typhoon and the Rafale in a gunfight is entirely dependent on the energy state that you merge at, the angle that you merge at, like who has the advantage going into it, who got pushed by the missiles in a way that puts them at a disadvantage. And because of this, because a lot of people have reacted to this plane being more or less just a really, really hyper-driven F-16, it's not as popular. It doesn't really play itself. It doesn't really do anything exceptional. It doesn't feel like it's the best plane in the game. Whereas if you have the Rafale and you have the best radar in the game and you have good missiles and you have good chaff and you get to play on basically the team that everyone else wants to play on, or on the team that nobody else wants to play against, because that is a thing, by the way, where some people do not want to play against Rafale. You can't decide to not play against Typhoon or just the Typhoon, because it's on Germany and it's on Britain and it's on Italy. So no matter what matchmaker you get into, you're not gonna be able to avoid the Typhoon unless you make your own U.S. versus China and Russia matchmaker, which is also just a thing now in Sim that people are doing to avoid the power creep. Now, with all that being said, is the Rafale better? And I don't think that it is. I think it's just different, and I think that a lot of people that are coping about the Eurofighter radar being terrible have not really experienced what an actual awful radar the Su-27 is, or kind of even the German F4F Ice. That radar is very terribly average. It's good, but it's good for being average. The German F4F Ice not having a HUD or an HMD, or not being able to actually see any targets whatsoever, where you don't have any green triangles, you don't have any green squares or dots or anything like that to really indicate what's going on. That's it, to me. The perspective of people that have had it so good for so long, where this just becomes to me, the radar not being great is just kind of an inconvenience. It's I'm able to work around. I'm getting pushed from two sides, by the way, and I've switched over to the HMD because I'm able to manage my space well, and I'm able to make a good decision of what radar mode to be using, when to be using it, and kind of managing my space, because the scan patterns for the Eurofighter radar are basically this wide pattern that's really good if you're on the deck, or you're scanning very far and wide and you want to see things across the map to just get a general idea of where things are at. And then you got a medium pattern, which is kind of a good utility pattern for doing everything. And then you have the narrow pattern, but the narrow pattern is actually not that good because it is a narrow pattern. So it's narrow left and right, but it's also narrow up and down. So it means if you're not tilting the radar at the exact right angle, where if the guy dove and you didn't realize it, you don't pick them up, you're going to be coping. So with the Eurofighter, one of the things that you should be doing is, once the target is within 11 kilometers, once it's like rendered as a dot for sure, you should just be using the HMD. Like, you need to be using the HMD. And the same thing goes for the Rafale radar and literally every other radar in the game. Because in order to get those fast missile shots off, those fast counterfire shots, you need to be using the HMD. Like, it's just, bar none, there is no real good way around it. Now, keep in mind, I'm going into this fight here, by the way. I've gotten pushed from two sides. I was able to notch all of the missiles that have came at me. I've been able to flare all of them. I am in a prolonged dogfight. Guess what? This is where the Eurofighter is very strong. It is basically stronger than every other plane in the game, including the Rafale. But with the Rafale, there's something of a little bit of a bugger here. And the bugger is manual controls. Manual controls increases the angle of attack limitations from basically 30 degrees all the way up to 50 degrees. And it means that if the other guy knows how to use it and you don't know how to use it, you're kind of fighting with a hand tied behind your back. Also, the manual controls, the limitations that the Rafale has, are a lot easier to exploit and do it safely than to do it with the Eurofighter. So the Eurofighter is better. To do better with it, manual controls is a higher skill ceiling. At the same time, as much as we discuss radar is important, situational awareness is important, all of this stuff is important, the reality is the game has not changed for the past 6 months. It arguably has not changed since Fox 3s were introduced. Basically, one of the most reliable strategies still is to go around on the deck and make sure to shoot your missiles so close that the other guy does not have time to react. That is one of the most consistently workable strategies that anyone can do. And it's also one of the most popular. This is why people play Denmark. This is why people play these maps. This is why people stick to multipathing on the deck. It is something that is easy to make work on a consistent basis. At the same time, it's a relatively boring way to play. I like going to altitude sometimes. There's also a certain point in the game where you can't fight at altitude because your team doesn't have any presence at altitude. Once a team has more players, once a team has better match presence, going to high altitude is usually a way for you to get pressured by more than one player at a time. And that's one of the things that's happening in this match, because in playing the Eurofighter and trying to test out like whether or not it's any good or whether or not everyone's coping, I'm going after Alex Rizzler because he's one of the French guys who's like a French main who's always in the Rafale now. And this is a game that started out, we were on the back foot. And guess what? I go up, I take off, I do bad, I do good. It depends. It's not like black and white. And for a lot of people, especially for people that are playing Great Britain, this kind of shift where things aren't black and white anymore. Things aren't where you're just kind of sleepwalking to a 95% win ratio, because that was the previous kind of iteration of the meta, was a 95% win ratio. Like the Gripen meta with the 9Ms, with multipathing, was the most hands down Britain-friendly meta to have ever existed. It was brainless. You did not have to know anything. Your whole entire gameplay loop was multipath on the deck, fly at the guy, and at a certain range, turn on periodic flares, and there you go, you're invulnerable. BOL pods were completely busted on release, where they were basically an invincibility cloak as far as missiles were concerned, and you were stuck in a jet that was hands down the best gunfighter of the time, and it still, if it was introduced again with its first flight model or its second flight model, it would be just as good, if not a better gunfighter than the current Rafale or the current Typhoon. So it means for people that were looking to the Typhoon to be the ultimate form of power creep, the ultimate fuck you to balance, it really hasn't proven to be that. And we're just on the cusp of another update, and all of these planes are getting some pretty significant upgrades, some pretty significant changes that are in the future. Not so much as the flight models. with the exception of my Cobra button coming to potentially goddamn everything, which I have some thoughts about that, and they're not very good thoughts, so I'm going to leave those out for another video. But the sensor stuff is going to get better. The sensor fusion, where the thing will do more for you, is going to get better, because the computerization of both of these planes was not really modeled. It was just kind of, half-assed with existing ways of modeling things, and the existing ways of modeling things have fallen short. With that being said, they are updating a bunch of stuff. At the same time, because of the power creep that is coming with the Su-30 and thrust vectoring and the R-77-1, everyone that is a European canard main, Americans, everyone is asking for new stuff, basically straight off the get-go, because it looks like Russia is going to have the best, active radar homing missile, coupled to an airframe that, at least in testing so far, seems to be conventionally abysmal. Conventionally, like in conventional terms, the Su-30 minus the thrust vectoring gimmick is thoroughly mediocre. The only thing that's kind of good about it is the radar, which finally, thank God, Russia's getting a good radar. But everything else, the flight performance, its climb performance, speed acceleration, turn rate, sustained turn rate, instantaneous turn rate, energy retention, is kind of just handily worse than everything else out there. The only thing that might be potentially more mid than the Su-30 once it gets introduced might be the FA-18C. But we shall see. The dev server is still new. The dev server is still up, and things always get changed 2 or 3 times, so that's why I haven't made a video immediately about reacting to it or saying that we need to run for the hills because the game is about to be completely ruined. Anyways, as far as the Eurofighter goes, getting back on subject, the British one's like, okay, it's literally just a Eurofighter. You have AIM-120s, you have AIM-9Ms, you have IRST. The IRST is bugged, by the way. The IRST, like, if you slew it up, just gets stuck in, like, Narnia, and if you slew it down, it does the same thing. It's the same kind of IRST bug that is on the MiG-23, and one of the bugs that everyone should be familiar with at this point. So, overall, my conclusion, after playing a good bit of this, after playing this against some of the better Rafale players, is that this plane's just as good. It really is the only other plane at top tier that, if you're a PvP player, is kind of super relevant from a competitive perspective. The Su-27 can still do good, the F-16 can still do good, a lot of the other stuff can still do good, but when it comes to, like, relevancy, these planes are hands down just more useful, more easy to use, and it's kind of sad to see people stop playing them because they perceive them to not be overpowered enough to be worth it, which is unfortunate. That is a very bad sign for the way the sim community is going and the way that kind of like the sim mode exists. So anyways, that's gonna be pretty much my video, because I mean, I don't really have a lot else to say, because I mean, it's another Eurofighter video, and it does feel a little bit dirty flying this thing around all the time, and it's really just it's another Eurofighter. It's a good plane. Just, I don't know, stop complaining about everything, and stop complaining that your nation hasn't been power creeped into frickin' oblivion so that other people can play the game. But anyways, that's it. We've done the Eurofighter video. Squishface is out. I'm gonna go get another 16 bush lights and pickle my liver.